going to talk about social development and gender. We'll see what time it is when we get done with that as to whether we want to start into personality. I am going to give you, I'm going to have you do a personality assessment sort of at home between now and next Wednesday, and we're going to talk about that in here. So I want to talk a little bit about how people respond to personality assessments and why we respond the way we do. But today we're going to talk about, we've already covered this part. We were at gender. All right. Close. Here we are. All right. So the first part of talking about sex and gender is to try to delineate the two concepts. From a psychological perspective, we treat sex and gender as two very different parts of a similar issue. In general, when we talk about sex characteristics or someone's sex, we're referring entirely to biology. So this is determined by primary sex characteristics. So our primary sex characteristics are reproductive organs. For most of us, males have an X and a Y chromosome. For most of us, females have two X chromosomes, but not always. And this is where things start to get more difficult from the get-go. So in APA style, when we're writing about some sort of difference between males and females, so for example, I've looked at smoking differences, I've looked at attention differences across sex and gender, and when we believe we're working in the area of biology, we refer to it as sex. If we think there's more social aspect to it, we refer to gender, but the lines are not as distinct as we might think. So the first, off the bat, is a situation called, a condition called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Individuals with androgen insensitivity syndrome have an XY chromosome, but are biologically female. So while they're genetically male, they're biologically female. They're born with female genitalia, generally have no idea that they have an XY chromosome until they reach puberty and don't start to menstruate. So individuals with androgen insensitivity syndrome develop pretty much entirely normally as female. What happens is we are inherently female, and it requires the presence of androgens, which are male hormones, and those cells have to recognize the presence of those androgens in order for us to develop as male. So what happens with a male fetus is the XY chromosome causes the prenatal environment to release androgens, particularly the mother, and as a result, the fetus will start to develop as male because their cells will recognize those androgens. In an individual with androgen insensitivity syndrome, those cells don't recognize the presence of androgens, so the fetus develops entirely female. Now, these individuals are infertile because they cannot develop ova, which are always a single X chromosome. So right off the bat, when people start talking about what sex you were born, and there's obviously been a great deal of controversy about this lately, because people who write those laws either didn't go to college or they didn't take my class. Because understanding sex and gender is far more nuanced and far more complicated than just what's on someone's birth certificate. So gender is a term we use to the culturally constructed differences between males and females. So our idea of maleness and femaleness is really what we talk about when we talk about gender. So what makes someone male or female is entirely culturally dependent in terms of their gender. Now, of course, one of the classic questions in this area is, what is the relationship between sex and gender? Well, in general, sex and gender are closely related, but not always. And it may be that sex has less to do with gender than we think about. And we can argue about this all the time. You get a bunch of psychologists and biologists and sociologists together, and they'll never agree. For my money, I think there are, it's almost just a semantic distinction. For From a research perspective, obviously, if we're interested in how sex hormones affect brain development, we think about these in one way. When we're talking about gender, we're almost always talking about things like gender roles. The first thing I want to talk about from a physical perspective, from sort of purely sex, cases, there are, of course, primary sex characteristics that are distinct between males and females. The external sex organs, which for males, of course, are penis and testicles. For women, includes the labia, the clitoris, and the outer vagina. Secondary sex characteristics start to develop in adolescence. This is where women start developing breasts, different hip distribution. Men start developing facial hair. Everybody develops body hair in various places. Most men just continue developing body hair as they get older, while the rest of their hair recedes. So that's something to look forward to, fellas. So those secondary sex characteristics start to develop in adolescence, and we'll talk about 5-alpha reductase deficiency, in which individuals who have been raised female and were basically born female, suddenly when they reach puberty, start expressing male primary and secondary sex characteristics. There are some other physical differences. These have some important distinctions and some not. So males tend to have larger rib cages and greater lung capacity. And so as a result, have a tendency, some males have a tendency to have some greater physical ability, certainly endurance ability. They can process oxygen more quickly. We also know that testosterone is related to muscle development. Males tend to have more muscle mass, can develop musculature more quickly. And as a result, we're also at a much greater risk of dying younger and losing our hair. So it's not all wine and roses. But these are generalities. So one of the first things, sort of caveats to this discussion, is we talk about sex and gender differences, we're talking about overlapping distributions. So if we were to look at height, then this would be males, females. We know the average male is taller than the average female, right? Basic sex characteristic. But we also know there are plenty of women that are taller than men. There's certainly plenty of women that are taller than me. I'm over somewhere here on the male height distribution. So when we talk about these differences, we're not talking about any individuals, and we're talking about population characteristics. I want to actually stop for 1 second. I don't know why I didn't list it up here. You may have actually seen this. Somehow this made this weird resurgence in the media recently. Males have larger brains, so they must be smarter. Anyone seen this? Kind of come up in a couple places recently. It's the reason why women were denied the right to vote or the ability to be doctors or lawyers. Do you know anything about why men's brains are bigger? Because we have bigger heads. Has nothing to do with brain capacity, nothing to do with ability. It's simply we have larger skulls, and so the brain actually just is larger. As a result, women's brains are more densely packed and in some ways more efficient. And so while men have bigger heads, as a result our brains take up more space. We don't have more brain power, we have more fluid and space in our heads. So it's one of those things that has been this part of junk science for centuries, and it keeps making these resurgences. When you adjust for body size, there's no difference in brain size. So once you adjust for how big someone is, their brain is a brain. But there are some physical and cognitive differences. Estrogen, which is of course the primary female hormone, is associated with verbal abilities. Females tend to have larger vocabularies. They tend to be much better at verbal tasks. They learn to read and write at a younger age. Females tend to have better perceptual abilities. They can hear a much higher range of frequencies, particularly high frequencies. I don't know if we talked about this. We talked about perceptual systems, but in the very first days of the personal computer, the IBM personal computer, they were designed entirely by male engineers. And they arrived in offices all across the country where they were used by female administrative assistants. Well, the male engineers could not hear the high-pitched sound that all of the computers were making. And so the first generation of computers drove women nuts because of this high-pitched sound. And so IBM, I think, finally either found themselves some female engineers or at least trotted a few through the warehouse before they sent these things off. But this example of how when you ignore something like a sex difference, you do so at your peril. We certainly know women have much greater senses of smell, in particular pregnant women. Pregnant women have incredibly well-defined senses of smell, and I know that's something we talked about previously. Males tend to have advantages in spatial relations, geographical knowledge, geographical ability, navigating based on cardinal directions. Women have really good object memory. How many of you were really good at that game Concentration when you were kids? Remember that? Yeah. Always girls in the class that were good at that. Because women have this really great object location memory, which is really pretty remarkable. So there are some cognitive differences. Now, are they because of physical differences? Are they because of differences in the way we raise girls versus boys? That's an open question. So some of the major cultural contributions to sex and gender has to do with gender roles. These are the characteristics associated with men and women because of cultural influence and learning. So what does it mean to be male and female? In my human sexuality class, we spend a lot of time grappling with this question. What is maleness and femaleness? What's masculine? What's feminine? Is it even an important thing to discuss anymore? Of course it is, because people still get wound up about it. People still make fun of each other, people who don't conform to gender roles. And it's something that we really have to think closely about. One of the things, my mother's, of course, from a couple generations ago, and she still has a hard time accepting female doctors. She still wants a male doctor. I keep telling her, well, that's too bad, because most medical students, in fact, by a large majority, medical students are far more likely to be women than men. Also, women make particularly good surgeons. Women are very good at fine motor skills. They also have smaller hands. So, if somebody's cracking your chest open and rooting around for something, you probably want smaller hands. Just saying. But we tend to associate different roles for different genders. In particular, we have come across a recent phenomenon of this idea of a gender schema. We have this idea about how men and women are supposed to act. I keep thinking they're going to get less and less, but they certainly influence how we perceive the behaviors of men and women. So one behavior can be perceived in one way in men and completely differently in women. So something like, and this is basically because we view behaviors in terms of what is expected. So aggression, males are supposed to be aggressive, right? That's manly. Whereas women who are aggressive are considered bitchy, they're considered power hungry. Certainly, you can see a lot of double standards on how we treat males and females. We saw this in the presidential contest last year. Certainly, there's some discussion right now about how much this kind of issue was part of the election. And one of the things that commentators are missing is we don't simply have expectations about other genders. That is, it's not that men have expectations about how women are supposed to act, or women have expectations about how men are supposed to act. It's both ways. And so women will vote against a female candidate if they violate their gender expectations. And so that's something to be mindful of, is that just because we're talking about one side of the coin versus the other, oftentimes our gender norms can be particularly violating for sort of both sides. And I see this all the time with how people treat kids. I have a friend who's raising I don't know how old he is, 5, 6, I don't know, he's about this tall. And, you know, he roughhouses a lot, but, you know, other parents are like, oh, well, you know, that's what boys do. So we expect boys to do different things, and so you expect them to behave differently. And as a result, you end up with reinforcing these gender expectations. I was a party at the same family's house and around the holidays, and this woman was telling me that her 4-year-old daughter got a makeup stand for Christmas, like with lights and mirrors and all sorts of, and I thought, wow, do you just want your daughter to be like pretty? Is that all she is to you? I mean, I was really stunned at that sort of really gendered toy, which is fine if that's what the little girl wanted. I don't imagine she would have been fine if her little boy wanted that. Same thing, the soft-spoken men are considered effeminate. We get into these, again, questions of masculinity and femininity. I think they don't serve us well. Obviously, I have fairly strong beliefs on a lot of these issues. But I think it's important for us to just simply think about. So last couple of bits to talk about in this. When we talk about people who are sex-typed, people who have a strong sex type, they believe there are strong differences between males and females. They rate themselves as being very masculine or very feminine. One of my research projects I've done, it wasn't all that recently, we were examining perceptions of masculinity in gay versus straight actors. And one of the questions we asking about people's sexual orientation is really difficult because men will have sex with men but don't consider themselves gay. Women will have sex with women but don't consider themselves lesbian. So trying to get at sexual orientation is a difficult methodological issue. So one of the things we had people do is rate their percentage attraction to males versus females. And as I was going through the survey response, you get this 200% attracted to women and negative 100% attracted to men. I mean, like a little overcompensating. And that's this kind of sex type. I always raised an eyebrow at those. I was like, somebody's protesting a bit much. They were obviously anonymous, so I didn't know who the student was. But you know, you get these kind of very strange responses. So that's sex type behavior. And then androgyny is where people who are between sort of male and female, difficult to have both masculine and feminine traits. Certainly plenty of this in pop culture. Many people celebrate their androgyny. Plenty of people dress both masculinely and femininely. You probably see some of that around campus. And I think there are a lot more people sort of embracing their sort of androgyny. Kind of fun to be able to do both. So that's a brief introduction to gender. We'll talk more about gender in a minute. I want to slip into talking a little bit about sexual orientation as we're talking about development. So we're going to talk about these issues. We'll talk about the potential for genetic predispositions as a reason for homosexuality, social explanations. Talk about what is really the current sort of favorite hypothesis, which is related to the levels of prenatal androgens. Talk about this question of whether or not gay and lesbian women is it the same sort of cause, etiology, is it different, does it matter, etc. Let's start with this question of genetic predisposition. The first thing I want to tell you about this discussion is just because something might not be genetic doesn't mean it's not biological. Right? People always assume when we're talking about a biological cause, it has to be caused by genetics. Not necessarily so. But there is evidence of a genetic component. In twin studies, it's really high similarity of sexual orientation between monozygotic twins who, of course, share 100% of their genes. But not always, so certainly it's not 100%. If it was 100%, you would expect every identical twin that to be the case. The heritability component of sexual orientation is about 28 to 65%. So somewhere in there. Pretty wide range, so this research is not very precise. In terms of familial environment, much lower, tend to range from not at all to 39%. These studies are, of course, done with identical twins, fraternal twins, adopted siblings, identical and fraternal twins raised apart, that sort of thing. There appears to be a potentially genetic component here. Unfortunately, some of this concordance and discordance rates are confounded by other issues, like prenatal androgen levels, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Because certainly monozygotic twins develop in the same uterus, right? And as a result, the level of the androgen levels for both twins is going to be relatively similar, so it could be that, not the shared genetics. Kind of a Gordian knot to try to take apart. So other studies have attempted to find this so-called gay gene. Oh, look there. One set of research has claimed to found a gene on the X chromosome. One of the things you see a lot in this literature is looking at rates of gay males versus lesbian females. And in general, there's about a 2-to-1 ratio of gay males to lesbian females. In study after study, this is one of the things that comes up. If you remember back to our discussion of color blindness, remember this part of the X chromosome isn't matched on the Y chromosome. So if there is a sex-linked trait, it's going to be there. But just really much more complicated picture than that. So the other alternative hypothesis some people have is that it's socialized. People somehow learn to be gay, or their mothers make them gay. That was Freud's, sort of Freudian, not exactly, but certainly part of these like 50s, 60s. A couple things here. There is this idea that the exotic becomes erotic. And let me talk you through this. So as children, gay kids feel different from their same-sex peers, and as a result, they see those same-sex peers as more exotic, and then that becomes an attraction, this kind of misattribution of arousal. I don't know about that, but it certainly is plausible. There's, of course, the age-old chestnut of over-domineering mothers and absent fathers as the cause of homosexuality. That's not really borne out at all. The one bit of this that is true, but is certainly true, is that gay males are more likely to have older brothers. And the more older brothers you have, the more likely you are actually to be gay. Now, not every gay male has older brothers, but this relates directly to the androgen level hypothesis. So some theorize that lower levels of androgens are responsible for gay males, but higher levels of androgens for females. It's actually backwards. We'll talk about exactly how this works out. Simon LeVay was the first person to actually look at some biological differences in the brains between gay males and heterosexual males. Unfortunately, his entire sample involved individuals who had died of HIV or had died of AIDS in San Francisco in the late 80s. But he did find a slight difference in the anterior hypothalamus in gay men, which was more feminine in his view. And so this led to this idea of different androgen levels. Unfortunately, for LeVay, while the brain differences may be true, the androgen levels are actually quite different. It's actually that gay males tend to have higher levels of testosterone than their heterosexual counterparts. Lesbian women also have higher levels of androgens, and it's actually related to levels of prenatal androgens over time. And what happens is when well, let's go backwards. I don't have it all here. I'll just talk you through it. So what happens is, as women have more and more male children, the levels of androgens present in the prenatal environment increases each time. And as a result, you end up with gay male fetuses exposed to higher levels of prenatal androgens. This is observable in some biological markers in adults. So, for example, is what's called the 2D 4D ratio, which is these two fingers here. That's actually a marker of your exposure to prenatal androgens. Your forearm ratio to your upper arm, those two bones are related to prenatal androgen exposure. Gay males actually, on average, have larger penises than do their straight counterparts, which is also related to prenatal androgen levels. So all of this relates to this potential idea of there being a difference in the prenatal environment related to androgen levels. So one of the remaining questions is there some difference between how between male homosexuality and female homosexuality? Again, the evidence is mixed here, and I think it's not the same for everyone, and I don't think everyone should be thrown into the same sort of causal basket. That is, there are multiple potential reasons why someone might be gay. I think the most important thing for us to realize is it is biological for the most part, and so we need to consider that from a societal perspective. But there is evidence that male homosexuality may be more associated with genetic predispositions in biology. Female sexuality in general is more fluid, and so and that's true across the board. But there certainly are plenty of explanations in here that would fit probably lots of different situations. We certainly know most lesbian women have higher levels of testosterone, and we certainly know that there are a variety of potential factors involved. So, a couple things I want to just sort of leave you thinking about as we move on to finish talking about gender. First thing is, of course, there are lots of stereotypes about gay males. Some of them may be true for some males, not for others. I certainly see people in the community who sort of overreact to those. I can tell you that for every sport you can think of, there's a gay sports league. There's a huge gay rodeo circuit. In Colorado, there are 5 gay hockey teams that are sponsored by Coors. Here, there's this whole huge, there's the Chesapeake and Potomac Softball League. There's an entire gay kickball league. So most of the stereotypes we might find are not necessarily all that accurate. There's lots of interesting stuff about gay and lesbians in history. It's a whole question for another day. I do want to say a little bit about the history. So homosexuality was considered a mental disorder in the first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It was taken out in 1970, I want to say 73. Quote me on that, somewhere in there. Certainly didn't make it to the second DSM. And so I don't think sexual orientation is at all in the new DSM. I'd have to look. If it is, it's under people who are simply concerned about their sexual orientation, and certainly just need some help coping with that. For the most part, reparative therapy, that is trying to turn someone from gay to straight, absolutely, first of all, it doesn't work. Second of all, it's mostly illegal in a lot of places for a variety of reasons, but mostly because it doesn't work and there's no reason to try to change someone. A couple things finally to wrap up in this area. Gay and lesbian youth are at the highest risk for suicide, certainly at the highest risk for being bullied, and at great risk for hate crimes, which are actually currently on the rise, which hate crimes against everyone seem to be on the rise these days. So it's something to be mindful of. Most of you are familiar with the story of Matthew Shepard. who was killed in Laramie, Wyoming. I actually knew Matt. I didn't know him very well. I met him a couple times. I've actually gotten to know his mom since then. So it's just something to just be mindful of in this area. Have any questions they want to ask? If you want to come talk to me about stuff, certainly do so. We also have a great LGBT center on campus. So consider that. I want to talk a little bit about gender identity. Gender identity is a very complex question. When we start talking about how somebody identifies with their gender, this is an area that's rapidly changing in terms of how we view and think about gender. Certainly something like androgen sensitivity syndrome is a good example of why this is complex. There are others like 5-alpha reductase deficiency or Turner syndrome, which is somebody who just has one X chromosome and not another. And these questions really, or people with Klinefelter syndrome, which is 2 X chromosomes and a Y chromosome, you end up with lots of biological distinctions, but also this question of what really is gender, and how does somebody identify their particular gender. There's certainly people who are more gender fluid, and it's just simply a complex biopsychosocial construct that requires a lot of nuanced thinking for us to consider. Yeah. It's a theory, but there's a lot of evidence in support of it. So there's some historical data you can look at. So Kinsey's the first one. Alfred Kinsey, for which the Kinsey Institute and the Kinsey scale are named, was the first one to really systematically investigate this question. And if you go back into the Kinsey data, you can actually find evidence for this idea. So it's the older brothers. It's the 2D40 ratio. There's lots of work on the 2D40 ratio, which is these two fingers. And off the top of my head, I can't remember which way is which, but you can look it up. There's a lot of stuff on that, so it's pretty well accepted. You actually can see things like differences in mental rotation ability as tied to 2D40 ratio. So there's lots of sort of converging evidence. Nothing is widely accepted in this area. It's just sort of one of the prevailing hypotheses. Other questions? Yeah. Gay males tend to be associated with higher levels of androgens in the prenatal environment. Lesbians also tend to have. So actually, here's how it works out. It's actually not what. So the original theory was that gay males had lower levels of androgens, but it's actually, so if we go from lowest to highest, we have heterosexual females, followed by lesbian females, followed by straight males, or heterosexual males, and then gay males actually have the highest levels of circulating androgens. So this is in order of increasing testosterone levels or increasing androgen levels. Now there's some confounds. My people tend to be very fit. What's that? This over here? So basically we go from heterosexual females have the lowest levels of androgen, followed by lesbian females, followed by heterosexual males, followed by gay males. Gay males have the highest. And heterosexual females tend to have the lowest. Now, of course, overlapping everything in this, not everyone's identifiable. So, lowest to highest, yep. And it really counter-prevails what people thought. They always thought that gay males were sort of feminized versions of heterosexual males. Turns out it's more like hypermasculinized, which is against what you might think. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. It's such a complex question. And of course, all of this could lead to, so one of the things that hasn't really entered this discussion much is epigenetics. So what happens, I think we talked a little bit about this, is your environment can alter genetic expression in ways that we aren't always familiar with. So that could enter this mix somewhere. Yeah, it's complicated. And then, of course, this is starting to get more complicated as we get more nuanced views of sexuality. Now, we used to try to treat these as all discrete categories. Of course, it's not the case. So the way the Kinsey scale worked is Kinsey thought of sexuality as a continuum. So we had sort of entirely heterosexual at one end up to entirely heterosexual. Oh, sorry, homosexual. I'm trying to put heteros at both ends. And so you would kind of, I can't remember, I think it was a 7-point scale. Off the top of my head, I don't remember how big the scale was. But then you can just figure out where you are. And so somewhere here at 4 would be bisexual. We're starting to understand that sexual orientation and sexual behavior aren't exactly the same thing. That is, some people identify as being gay or lesbian. Other people don't, but are perfectly happy having sex with members of the same sex. And so we have to have a little bit more nuanced view of that. As in modern society, there is an app for everything. There's actually an app for that for straight males called BroSex. Can't remember what the app's called, but something about that. So this is kind of a pretty good way to think about sort of sexuality being, much less discrete and much more sort of fluid over time. And certainly over time, people's preferences sort of change and wax and wane. Other questions about that? So feel free to come and ask me more questions. Certainly an interesting area to talk about. We've got a half hour left. Let's see. Why don't we just hand back the exams? It's Easter break. And we'll pick up on this on Wednesday. All right, so what I have done actually is, this is just the results from your exam. I'm going to post a copy of the exam itself, because what happened was, you see what happened was, is when I went to print your exam, I printed the same version twice, so you actually all have the same version. So I'm just going to post exam form B. For those of you who had a proctored exam, I have yours up here. I graded yours by hand because I sent them the A's, so the A form. So if you are A through D here, we'll do the E's through the L's here, the M's through the R's, and the S's through the Z's. They're in alphabetical order, so try to retain that. And if you had to have your exam proctored, you can come get your exam from me. There you go. You bet. Oh, and it's on the very back page, Jonathan. So hey, there we go. Oh, I guess I could stop recording this.